Hello. Now, lately, we have experienced serious disruptions socially and economically. On one hand, the government continues to undertake measures to cushion Kenyans from the far-reaching effects of COVID-19 pandemic. But on the other hand, the reality is dire. Pay cuts, job losses, and paid leave being the new normal. Among the measures introduced are tax reductions, whose effectiveness is yet to be felt. On the show, let's take a closer look at this tax issue. What are we getting right? What are we missing? Are you feeling the tax measures any effect so far? What should be in our post-COVID-19 plan rather? My panel of experts will be dissecting this for us. Hello and welcome to Front Row. I'm your host, Akisa Wandera. Let's see who'll be part of this edition of the Front Row. But before that, to send in your questions, do that by logging into slido.com. Enter event code as hashtag the Front Row. We're also available on Twitter at KTNewsKE, at Akisa Wandera as well. Use the hashtag the Front Row. Here now are our panelists for this conversation. Starting us off, Maurice Ore, KRA, Deputy Commissioner for Corporate Policy. He is, of course, in charge of corporate policy at the Kenya Revenue Authority. He's responsible for legal reforms, stakeholder engagements, tax policy analysis, and technical interpretation of tax statutes. He's a member of the Kenya Double Taxation Treaty Negotiation Team and is a vice chairperson of the Nation Treasury Fiscal Budget Team. Ore was the first vice chairperson of the East Africa Revenue Authority's Technical Committee until 2012 and currently works with the East African community on the harmonization of domestic taxes in the region. Now, our second panelist is Wangari Muikia, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Expertise Global Consulting and has international expertise in global consulting with clients who include the World Bank, the Global Fund, UNICEF, Oxfam, and Danida. She's also a member of several boards of directors, joining us as a tax and economic expert. We also have Sandeep Singh, who is the head of KPMG Enterprise. He also doubles up as an associate director in the Tax and Regulatory Service Department. He has experience in providing accounting and taxation advice to local and multinational clients. And finally, on our panel tonight, Victor Otieno is the managing director of Vifa Consult Limited. This is a consulting outfit that offers research and data analytics to small and medium-sized enterprises. Otieno is passionate about the African entrepreneur and has so far worked with over 400 organizations in over 5 African countries in East and South Africa. This is our panelist tonight, but remember, once again, you can join us via slido.com. We'll also be giving you our Zoom login for if you want, of course, to join us via Zoom. On Twitter at Akisa Wandera, at KTNewsKE. The hashtag chooses the Front Row. We'll be taking in questions for either of the panelists and, of course, observations, opinions on the topic at hand tonight. But first, the COVID-19 pandemic is crumbling economies across the world non-discriminatorily. Though the outcome solely lies with a response by the government, so far the Kenyan government has taken a number of interventions, including reduction of taxes, pay cuts, and even a loan from the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. The critical question is, what is the most sustainable economic approach to tackling COVID-19 in Kenya? KTN's Noah Kipkemboi starts us off with that report.
With most businesses, if not all, making losses, employers laying off staff, and pay cuts becoming the new normal, the solution to the highly negative impact of COVID-19 in Kenya should boil down to the people.
Chakula tena serikali isimamie watu, maana kuna watu wanahangaika, kuna watu wako tuko manyumba, hawatoki ukienda kazi. Serikali inatakana isimamie ijua watu watakula namna gani.
Many of the measures taken have been lying on the fiscal policy side, touching on government spending and tax cuts.
Fiscal policy measures are designed for economic slowdown. But what we have right now is the largest economic crisis possibly since World War II. So what we need to do is, yes, adopt those fiscal policy measures, but now move towards monetary policy.
Some of the monetary policy the central bank has taken include the lowering of the central bank rate to 7% and the cash reserve ratio to 4.25%.
What our analysis has shown is that central bank rate is not very effective in terms of transmitting liquidity into the system, and banks right now are very risk averse.
The central bank can also take direct measures to see more money in circulation.
So the central bank really has a mandate of creating that liquidity and can partner with mobile money operators to inject it directly into the economy. So the net effect is always higher money supply into the system. That increases aggregate demand, people are able to buy goods and services, businesses are able to operate.
To do this, there is need to check how much money is needed.
And in my sense, it's about 10% of GDP, because we've lost about 10% of GDP.
The suggestion is to have 3 tiers of cash injection.
We should have a corporate cash injection, we should have SMEs cash injections, and we should have now individuals, especially those who are highly vulnerable in the slum areas.
Economic outlook for 2020 dampened, with Kenya's outlook being projected to grow at 1.5%, according to the World Bank. Nokip Kemboi, KTN News.
All right, Nakib Kamboi there, starting us off with an overview of what really the situation is like. I'd like us to begin straight with our panelists before, of course, we open up our lines for our viewers to chime in into the conversation, perhaps questions to the panelists or any additional information that you think would be great for this conversation at this particular hour. Let's start with Morris, because he's from the Kenya Revenue Authority. Mr. Morris Ore there, joining us live from home, as is the norm now. A lot of disruptions we are talking about since the pandemic came in to the country. So he will be giving us an overview of what really this is like at the KRA as far as revenue collection is concerned. But let's get an overview of what the Tax Amendment Acts are like. This, of course, features the tax reductions. We're talking about payee, we're talking about VAT, other introductions. Sanjip, perhaps KPMG does a lot of analysis around things like this. Just start us off with an overview of what this is like for Kenyans.
For me, this is basically, so yes, KPMG does do a number of analysis with regard to the Tax Amendments Act, and basically the few changes that I would think are cushioning the taxpayers and businesses against COVID-19 is exactly what you mentioned. There was a reduction through the Tax Amendments Act in terms of the corporation tax and pay-as-you-earn from 30% to 25%. Yeah, and then there was also the introduction or the change to the turnover tax, whereby the threshold was increased from 5 million shillings to 50 million shillings, and the lower limit is now 1 million shillings, which then essentially means that businesses perhaps earning less than 1 million would then be tax exempt. One of the other major changes that came through was, or rather the stimulus package that the President announced, was the release of 10 billion shillings to VAT refunds that have been processed. Although we are yet to see whether this money has actually reached the taxpayers, but it is something that I'm sure, if released to the taxpayers, would greatly aid the fight against COVID-19 and would ease the cash flows of a lot of manufacturing and SME companies.
So is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? From where you sit, what does this mean for Kenyans?
Well, of course, any tax relief would be very good, but now the implementation of the same is what I think would have to come to pass. A lot of these changes that, although there were a lot of positive changes through the reliefs, there have also been a number of changes that are basically increasing the tax base. And allow me to talk briefly about the zero rate, the exemption of vaccines as well as medicaments that were previously zero rated. This essentially means then despite the COVID-19 pandemic, medicines would then become more expensive to the end user. There was these other changes that were introduced through the Tax Amendments Act that talked about the tax incentives. So the laws are no longer as we know them. There have been a major overhaul of the Income Tax Act in terms of even the tax allowances, a reduction in tax allowances, as well as the spreading of something called the investment deduction claim. And the investment deduction claim was predominantly for companies investing significant amounts of cash into the country, also resulting in FDI, foreign direct investments. But now spreading this particular investment deduction essentially means that I could be actually in a tax-paying position in the first year of operations. Initially, it was 100% for most companies, and if you do construct outside counties of Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, then you'd be entitled to 150%.
Right.
But that 150% has since been scrapped. Yeah. And now the spreading of this would essentially mean that I could be in a tax-paying position in the first year of operations.
All right, let's bring
so
in
it's a bittersweet moment in my personal opinion.
All right, great. Yeah. Thank you. Very good to delve into taxing of vaccines and some of the other things you've talked about. We'll get into that shortly. Ongare, just for your opening statements, as we start off with you, looking at the tax reductions of the tax reliefs that Sanjeep has also quickly gone through, and there's now a conversation between the government really has tried here to come up with measures that will cushion Kenyans, but then there's a problem of we are losing jobs, we are getting pay cuts. How will these reliefs help us? Dissect for us this.
Well, it's very interesting because even as one of the reliefs says that 24,000 and less will not be taxed, the issue is that people who are earning 13,000 and less were already not being taxed. So really the people who are relieved from tax are between the gap of 13 and 24,000, about 11,000. And I'm not quite sure that that covers a large percentage of the population. Already the people who are being paid 13,000 and less were already vulnerable. So what's going to happen with them? What's going to be able to put in place to relieve their challenges?
I believe we now have the KRA Deputy Commissioner to just get us an understanding of what this period has been like for the revenue collecting body, the KRA. Okay, I believe, I understand we don't have him. He will be joining us shortly. But a lot of these conversations on cushioning Kenyans have majorly been focusing on SMEs, low-income earners in the country. We have one of them here as an SME and a policy advisor on these things. Victor, welcome here on front row this particular hour. Talk to us about these measures and what they've meant for the SMEs. How effective have they been so far?
Thank you very much, Wakisa. I think maybe to start us off is maybe to express the idea that tax is one of the many measures that maybe government can use to be able to backstop SMEs in Kenya. And I think we need to broaden the context to highlight that government has other tools on its arsenal that it can use to maybe backstop SMEs. So the first thing tool that government has is alleviating access to finance. And we've seen government maybe announce a credit guarantee scheme. So I think it would be very prudent of the people who are involved to ensure that the access of finance by SMEs through the guarantee scheme is all-inclusive, and it really actually has the real impact that it is envisioned to have to SMEs. And the second arsenal second tool that government has is markets, or enabling markets for SMEs. Government, for example, between 2013 and 2017, its import bill increased 5 times to around 38 billion. With items such as furniture, textile, foodstuff, as well as machinery. So you can imagine if even a portion of that 38 billion was given to SMEs in terms of supplying government with furniture as an example. And the last item that government has is policy. So ensuring that other broader policies that affect SMEs are looked into. Up to right now, we still have one SME in manufacturing applying to, for 3, 4, 5 permits in different agencies. So I think if all these issues can be looked at in totality and addressed coherently, then probably now we can be able to start addressing issues around tax.
Perhaps let me just take you back. I like that you mentioned some of the things that you feel should go in tandem with some of these tax measures for it to be effective in totality. But really, who's an SME in this country at this particular point? As a data analyst around this, what are the numbers like? Do you feel all SMEs have been taken care of in this conversation around tax measures?
Yeah, so I think that's the next question that we should be asking ourselves, in the sense that who really are we talking about when we talk about SMEs? Just if you're to reference to Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, we know that 79% of SMEs are informal or are unregistered. So already we can see them being below the threshold of most of these tax measures. Number two is of all the SMEs, 81% of them are small. So meaning that these are SMEs that have annual turnovers of between 0 to 5 million, for example, annually. So it means that probably they might not again fall in that threshold. The last demography I would maybe like to share is that based again on Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, in terms of sector distribution, we have SMEs majorly being around wholesale and retail, repair of motorcycles and motor vehicles, as well as accommodation and food services. So already that gives you an indication of whether these measures are really trickling down to the SME sector or not.
Good question there, and I think I'll also pose it to Sanjip. Just to remind you, Mr. Maurice Ore will be joining us shortly. We are still trying to get his connection to be as clear as possible for him to be able to articulate some of the issues from the KRA side. So Sanjip, we're talking about the SMEs there. Victor saying that perhaps maybe some of these measures have not fully covered those that we like to group within the small and medium-sized enterprises. Of course, also going as far as giving us the statistics around 79% and so on. So as a person who's worked in this sector and analysis, what are your thoughts on how then would we have ensured we cushion all the SMEs within these new tax relief measures and even what we are looking at in the economic stimulus package?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And probably just to re-emphasize, the definition of SME might vary from one to the other. So we do have KPMG and the Kenya Association of Manufacturers did conduct a survey, and the definition of an SME for a CAM perspective is anyone earning or anyone with a turnover of about 250 million shillings. But from a KRA perspective, as you can see, the turnover tax is mostly targeted to SMEs. And as I mentioned earlier, they have actually increased the threshold from the previous 5 million to now 50 million. And the VAT threshold has still remained at 5 million. So it actually gives you an indication of what exactly would then be the SME from a regulator perspective. What is an SME from, say, an association perspective? So the definitions may vary. But in terms of the incentives reaching these particular SMEs, whichever the classification may be, I already talked about the turnover tax, which I think for me is a brilliant move by the government to actually increase the threshold to 50 million and also include companies, registered companies. There was a public notice by the Kenya Revenue Authority which actually then clarified that fees such as management, professional and residential does not fall in this ambient. But then again, an income of a company can include the same. So there's still a bit of a debate going on around that. So that particular incentive, I can definitely say, has reached the SME sector. But probably from the other incentives, such as the spreading of the investment deduction, as I mentioned earlier, it is actually taken away from these SMEs who have invested, say, millions or billions of shillings in the first year of income, and then they're not allowed to take 100% tax deduction against their taxable income. So probably, I think what you had mentioned earlier with regard to pay-as-you-earn, you're absolutely right. I mean, the deduction of pay-as-you-earn rates might have gone from 30 to 25%, but does that translate into employers keeping employees? Does that translate to a retention of employees within various employers?
A big question
so
there.
Basically, those are the questions that do have.
Yes, definitely a big question that we'll be trying to maneuver around, even as a number of Kenyans are still sending in their questions and thoughts on this particular subject. Wangari, we've talked about the pay-as-you-earn, and as Sanjip puts it, the fact that we have reductions, does it mean then that employers will be keeping their employees? Certainly not. We're still seeing a high number of Kenyans losing their jobs, those being sent on unpaid leave, of course, the job cuts, so on and so forth. Then there's a question of the VAT from 16% to 14%. Then there comes an argument that, but still, there's this high cost of living occasioned by the COVID-19 pandemic. How do we maneuver this as a country? That's for Wangari.
I think, Akisa, I think we need to be very clear that a lot of these tax incentives are addressed to people who are in informal businesses, right? So for majority of the business, which about 80% of businesses in the country are informal, it's not going to touch them. So if we're seeing a lot of unemployment, we're seeing a lot of job cuts, a lot of people who are being laid off, it's because these tax reliefs are not reaching them, because they're informal, because they're not paying PAYE, they're not paying the income tax, they're not paying the turnover tax. So we need a different types of solution for these types of businesses, which employs the majority of the population in Kenya. We need to make sure that we have some sort of direct interventions for them. We need to make sure there may be wage subsidies, maybe even the liquidity that's afforded through the CBR or the cash reserve ratio. Hopefully there would be a multiplier effect that would go down to the banks, and the banks would release excess liquidity to a lot of these companies. But because these companies may not even be able to access loans because they're not formalized, then we have some sort of glut and sluggishness in the economy. And I think this kind of direction towards quantitative easing that the central bank is trying to push may not have the desired effect just because of the structure of the economy. Now, how do we take this forward? We need to really make sure that we have things like reliefs, utility reliefs. We need to have things like free electricity, free water, maybe some Wi-Fi connectivity. A lot of children are going to school. They're not having access to the school feeding programs. So maybe having food programs delivered to the households. That will provide some relief to households, and most of these households are employed in the SME sector.
But Wangari, as we're talking about the reliefs and whether really the government got it right or wrong, it's a government that also needs to finance itself. It needs to finance the upcoming budget, 2020-2021, just about a month or less away from now. So it looks like a delicate balance for the government. What then do they need to put in place to just ensure that, one, they're not losing their tax base, and two, Kenyans' pockets don't continue to run empty on the daily?
If you look at the finance bill as it stands now, it really is trying to cater for the reliefs or the revenue hole that has been created by the reliefs, right?
Yes.
So what we're seeing is that the county, the national government is trying to tax more on manufacturing, tax more on agriculture base, while trying to provide a little bit more reliefs on the more vulnerable in society. But then we do see it's an imbalanced basket, because we're seeing things like the liquid petroleum gas is starting to be taxed, which is something that a lot of the vulnerable in the society are relying on. But on the other side, you see maize is now exempt. So it's a little bit of a confused basket, I would say. I wish the KRA director was here to answer a little bit more of these questions.
We'll be getting him shortly. We're still trying to sort that connection, but Maurice Ore will be joining us shortly here on the conversation to, of course, just speak as far as care is concerned. What are some of these measures that are being put in place that Kenyans are saying they're not effective? What are we looking to do? He'll be trying to understand or answer a number of these questions for us. But for now, I want us to quickly take a short break. You're watching Front Row. Any questions you have, comments, observations, to join us on slido.com. I'll be taking a number of your questions. When we get back, be sure to tell us which panelist the question goes to. On Twitter at KTN News, KE at Akisa Wandera. The hashtag to use is the Front Row. And of course, our logins on Zoom. You'll be getting them on your screen shortly, just to be able to be part of this conversation. This is your show, and so why your participation is very important for us. Let's take that break. We'll be back with more.